Greetings everyone, I'm the man behind the anime girl, and today we're here to talk about Capcom Fighting Collection. I'm going to briefly discuss my thoughts on each game in this collection, though before I do that, I do want to say this game has an excellent art gallery function in it for any of you who are into that kind of thing. For those of you interested in achievements, this collection is an easy 100% while being a little tedious. I won't say time consuming because this only took me 18 hours to complete, while it took me over 100 hours for Street Fighter 6 and Mortal Kombat 1. But it can be tedious because when you're doing this for achievements rather than just enjoying these good old retro fighters, it's very repetitive since you need to beat every single game with every single character. Most fighting games have an achievement for completing the arcade ladder with every character, but those are individual games rather than a collection of 10. There are minor workarounds to make this faster, such as turning the difficulty down to 0, which is by my footage, you'll notice the enemies are not putting up much of a fight, killing two birds with one stone, recording while I'm grinding. The other thing is, since the collection has a quick save feature, the ideal strategy in most of these games is to get to the boss, lose, quick save at character select, then you can just keep reloading the quick save to beat the boss with every character. Yes, it sounds cheap, but even the best of fighting game players are typically not good with every character in the roster. I'm going to start with Hyper Street Fighter 2, which is the footage that we'll have been playing by now. This is an interesting one for me because while I do have really fond memories of Street Fighter 2, with Bison being one of my favorite gaming villains of the 90s and Cammy being one of my major gaming crushes as a teenager, I have an opinion about this game that will anger some of the purists while I speak it. I just overall found Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix on the Xbox 360 more enjoyable. It had a better implemented system for super attacks, and it had some balancing stuff done to make it more up to snuff with the quality of life fixes people expect in newer fighters. Like Cammy's side knuckle attack actually going through projectiles like it's known for, while in the original game it was a nearly useless special move. That said, the music and visuals are still enjoyable years later, and the endings, while some of them have been retconned, are still entertaining. And the only way to play HD Remix on modern hardware is with Ultra Street Fighter 2 on the Switch, and I hate Nintendo's hardware. So I gotta take what I can get. Next we'll talk about Gem Fighter. It's kind of funny to say this, but I feel this silly little game is the biggest standout in the collection. With the cute SD character visuals, having the punch button do an auto 4-hit combo if you mash it, and the gems and other items you pick up powering up your character in mid-battle, well, this game, ironically enough, has a lot of mechanics and flavor that we can't say are in any modern fighting games. It was unique for its time and still is today because there's nothing resembling a spiritual successor to it. Though from the achievements hunting perspective, this was one of the annoying ones in which you switch characters after continuing, it makes you start the arcade ladder from the beginning, which kind of defeats the point of using continue. That would have been blasphemous in the arcade where doing so costs a quarter and you gotta refight all the opponents. I actually can't believe that this was a thing in this. It's kind of weird. On to Puzzle Fighter. Part of me wants to say this is Tetris, but you play against an opponent, but that's not accurate. Because in Tetris, you only have to make a single line of blocks to eliminate them. In this, you have to get one of those spinning swirls that shatters blocks of the same color to come into contact with them. Out of every game in this collection, this is probably the one I'm least qualified to say much about because I'm not good with puzzle games, at least not ones where you have to think fast. I'm more of a slow strategic type, but I assume this is fun for people who are into that. Cyberbots is one in this that is kind of really weird. All of the mechs in this control in a bizarre manner compared to what you would usually expect in a fighting game. I can't think of too many other fighting games where I'll whiff with an attack while standing right in front of my opponent. But I think what probably really held this game back during its original release is that its story is a bit too involved for an arcade fighting game. The setting involves an Earth where an evil organization is in charge and is experimenting on children to create a doomsday weapon. That's the short explanation of the story. All the personal entanglements between the characters I feel was way too much to put in an arcade game, but Capcom was obsessed with their arcade games when this probably should have been an RPG on a home console. Most people only know who Jin is because he was in the Marvel vs. Capcom series, and Devilot somehow got put in Puzzle Fighter. Ironically, though, everyone praises NetherRealm for their story modes put in their fighting games, and apparently Cyberbots did it over a decade before them. Red Earth is a similar situation to Cyberbots. The story of this Red Earth where an all-powerful evil force is corrupting the world and turning people into monsters feels like a story for an RPG, especially with the way the world map looks in this. But on top of everything I said about the storytelling in Cyberbots, this game also has a leveling system. And when you finish playing it, it gives you a password. You can continue to play with the same levels you already got in the character the next time you come back to the arcade and play the game. which I imagine would have been insane at arcades because who brings a pen and paper with them to the arcade to write down a password? Also, this game is so story involved that each of the four characters has different endings that have different criteria to unlock them. Which I should point out at this point, that's something I said about the achievements earlier. This game, Cyberbots and Gem Fighters, you can't continue and switch characters. This one also had the most tedious endings to unlock because each character has one where you have to have continued 20 times before beating the boss. That means you have to intentionally lose repeatedly and continue to get that, to basically unlock a consolation prize ending, but you need them for the achievements. That said, though, I can say I actually like the combat and overall game feel in this way more than Cyberbots, so if I wasn't achievement grinding, this game would rank higher for me out of the two of them. Now we get to the Darkstalkers games, which make up half of the collection in this. I'm going to start off with some comments of the series in general here. There are a lot of characters I love in this series. Dimitri and Pyron are two of my favorite video game villains from the 90s. Felicia, Cienko, and Lilith were all massive crushes for me. Donovan, BB Hood, Victor, Morgan, and Talbane were all amazing characters. Only characters I really felt meh on were Sasquatch and Rikuo. But after the thoughts I found myself thinking about after playing Red Earth and Cyberbots, I also found myself thinking, what may have held this series back from getting as big as Street Fighter is there's really immense amount of lore in this series that I feel probably doesn't get explored well enough in a fighting game. Street Fighter takes place in a normal world, and while there are some lines in this that imply that characters know who the Street Fighter characters are, there isn't really much of anything to explain the lore of what Darkstalkers actually are, or how most of the characters relate to each other outside of endings that can be inconsistent between the first and third game. The anime kind of rectified some of this, but not everyone watched the anime, and the anime wasn't perfect either because it would kind of fluctuate back and forth between looking like the modern world and looking like the Middle Ages. Talking about Darkstalkers 1 itself, it looks beautiful, but it is missing a lot of things the series as a whole is kind of known for. Capcom still hadn't finalized how they wanted to deal with super attacks, so your meter resets after every round, and there weren't that many flashy super attacks to begin with, which are kind of what this series and Street Fighter Alpha are known for. The endings in this and the sequel are the exact same except for the endings for the new characters in the sequel. The endings are kind of nothing burgers that tell us next to nothing about the characters. Morgan and Dimitri's rivalry isn't even really hinted at in this game. The first game, looking back on it, sadly, is that, while not bad, is just kind of irrelevant after the sequels came out. The second game, titled Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge, is for all intents and purposes less of a sequel and more of an upgrade to the previous game in the way Champion Edition and Super version of Street Fighter II were, adding more playable characters. But this was also when they figured out super attacks, gave us a good selection of them to use, and not only made it so your super attack meter carried over into the next round, but you have more than one level of it to charge at a time. Other than that, though, it's just the first game again. Vampire Savior and the two other variations of it that are on this thing kind of annoy me about this collection, and it's an annoyance I have with Capcom in general. All of their collections that aren't Mega Man seem to only have arcade games. In their various beat-em-up collections, this has resulted in them never giving us any of the Final Fight games aside from the first one, because it's the only one that was an arcade game. In this instance, we don't get a single game that has the complete Darkstalkers roster, even though Darkstalkers 3 on the PlayStation 1 had all of the characters and more modes. It was essentially the definitive Darkstalkers game, and we should have gotten a remaster of that, unlike what they did here and what they did with the Darkstalkers Resurrection digital release on the PS3 and Xbox 360. Especially when the PS3's PSN store already had the PS1 version of Darkstalkers 3 available. That said, what I have to say about Vampire Savior beyond that, this game introduced Lilith, BB Hood, QB, and Jetta. However, due to the limited available memory in the arcade cabinets, this game is missing Donovan, Huitzel, and Pyron from its roster. But the real noteworthy thing about this game is probably another thing people falsely credit NetherRealm for doing first. This game uses a lives system instead of a round system, meaning you start with 2 lives. When one person loses a life, the other person doesn't get their health back because the fight just keeps going from there. This was a big thing in the Injustice games, and it can be argued how well this works for balance, because after you lose a life, it's a lot harder to make a turnaround than if you just lost a round in a different fighting game. Oh yeah, and before I forget, a major falsehood that gets tossed around about the series starting with this game is that Lilith is Morgan's younger sister. She is not. She is a fragment of Morgan's soul that took physical form. Feelings about the roster differences aside, though, I'd say this is probably the best Darkstalkers game in the collection because the other two variations of this don't have English or, well, any other translation that's not Japanese. Vampire Hunter 2 is literally just the roster of Night Warrior's Darkstalkers Revenge, but with the upgraded life and gameplay systems from Vampire Savior. It's in raw Japanese, and beating the arcade mode doesn't even result in an ending of any kind, whether you could read it or not, just leads to credits rolling. For all intents and purposes, this game is just good for if you want to do a versus against another player with this roster and the updated gameplay. Vampire Savior 2 is Vampire Savior, except they swatched out Sasquatch, Rikuo, and Talbane to put Donovan, Huitzel, and Pyron back in the game. Talbane is a major loss, but overall I'd say I prefer this roster more. However, like Vampire Hunter 2, this is also in pure Japanese and doesn't give you an ending for beating arcade. So once again, this is mainly just to have versus matches against another player with your preferred roster if you do in fact prefer this roster. So those are my overall thoughts on each individual game, stated as briefly as I could. I can't go into too much detail or this video would be insanely long. But what I do think about this collection as a whole, probably more fun if you're not achievement grinding like I was, but in any case, it's good that there are versions of these games that can be played on modern hardware for preservation reasons if nothing else. Hope any of this info might have been helpful to you in spite of me posting this a few years after the collection released and rambling a bit. So until next time everybody, happy gaming.
And with that, you've made it to the end of the video. Thank you for watching. Make sure to do that like, comment, and subscribe thing that everyone's always talking about. Otherwise, Azina will be angry. You don't want to see Azina when she's angry.